Hello. Can you please introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. So my name is Eli. I'm from London and I'm an English teacher and I specialize in IELTS preparation. So I've been teaching now, I don't know how many years, maybe around 10 years. And I started teaching in Spain, in Barcelona. I also taught in the UK, in Scotland, and also in Manchester University, and then also in China, in Shanghai. And for the last 5 years of my teaching, I've really specialized in IELTS preparation. And so that led me to start a website called EnglishProTips.com, which helps students to prepare for the IELTS test. The way my website works is you can create a free account, and that gives you access to the first few lessons of all of these different courses. So you'll find a speaking course, a listening course, a reading course, and lots of writing courses. And each of these courses will help you with a particular part of the IELTS test. Now, most people sign up to my website because they want help with the writing test. I'm sure, as you know, the writing test is probably the most difficult part of the IELTS test.
Yes.
And usually students will need to get band 6.5 or maybe band 7 in order to move abroad or get into their university. So lots of people sign up to my website to get help with their IELTS writing.
So first, I've got these questions from my viewers, and it would be great if you could answer some of these questions. Do you have any recommended books or podcasts for people who are preparing for IELTS?
Yeah, so in terms of podcasts, I recently spoke to a student from the Philippines who told me that she loves a podcast by this guy called Ben Worthington. It's actually on Spotify.
Oh,
And what she loved about it was that the host, so this guy called Ben, asks you these kind of IELTS style questions, and then he also gives his answer. So you learn kind of useful vocabulary and different structures for answering the different questions. And she loved that it was in podcast form. So when she was just commuting to work, she would listen to that. And then she ended up getting a very high score, a band 8 in her speaking. So it's definitely testament to that podcast. The other one that I'd recommend is by My IELTS Classroom. And I'm sure you can find it on Spotify or on the internet. And I'd recommend it just because I think the teacher, a teacher called Shelley, is just absolutely wonderful. She takes a lot of pride in producing very high quality work, and she's very funny.
I think that's a good choice. I have to look that up as well. And the next question is how to start preparing for IELTS when they have little to no experience in English.
Right. So I don't really recommend starting to prepare for IELTS if you have little or no English. And the main reason is at the end of the day, IELTS is an English proficiency exam. So yes, you can learn exam technique, but ultimately it's only really the students that have a very good level of English that's going to get a high score. So you're a perfect example. You have an absolutely amazing level of English and probably less exam experience or less knowledge about IELTS. But because your English is so good, you got a really, really good score in the IELTS test. So I would recommend if you don't have a lot of English, forget about IELTS for now, and then really just focus on improving your English. And then after you feel comfortable in English, that's when you start looking into the nitty gritty about the exam. Would you agree with that?
I actually agree with that. But what if they don't have experience and you recommend them to practice or get better in English first? What is recommendation for them to become better in English?
Right. Well, I mean, it's very personalized, I think. But, one of the amazing things about learning language nowadays is there are so many different methods and resources. So I know some people that really like going down the app route. For example, I used to teach this Spanish guy, and he did okay in class, and I could see that he enjoyed the classes, and he always arrived early, and he always did the homework, but he didn't really thrive. Now, that was until he started using all of the language learning apps, and he loved them. So because I was his teacher, I used to get these updates on how many lessons he'd done every week. And he would just do kind of like something like 30 hours of all of these language apps.
Wow.
Like, it was like a full-time job.
Wow.
Of all of these language apps, because it really worked for him. Now, I don't really think it's the best way to learn a language through these learning language apps. Often they teach you these kind of strange phrases like there are 4 monkeys dancing in the tree, which aren't necessarily the kind of things that you say in an everyday conversation.
Yeah.
However, I think if it works for you, and even if it's not the most effective way of learning a language, if you're enjoying yourself over the long run, it's going to be very beneficial. What about you? Do you use many language learning apps?
I would say no, because I actually don't know where to start. Like there are so many apps nowadays, so I don't know which one is like the right one for me, and I ended up not using one at all.
So you're a bigger fan of television, right? As a way to learn a language.
Yes, I watch a lot of movies, and I find that through movies I really get like pick up lots of words and like grammar points as well. So I feel like it's like best suited for me.
And I've heard that from a lot of people. And in fact, all of the people that I've ever spoken to that have a very high level of a foreign language are the ones that do watch a lot of television. So I think there's no coincidence there. My question to you would be, how do you watch television? What's the kind of procedure? Is it a case of just kind of lying back passively and spending enough time, or do you actively involve yourself in the process in order to learn a language?
I think mine would be the first one. So I just sit there and relax and like spend my my free time watching something, and it will automatically like learn something from that. I feel like for me the best way to learn a language would be through learning it naturally. So you don't have to try and force yourself into learning something. Just leave it naturally, and you pick up some things, like your brain or your like something would happen, like you would pick it up automatically.
Yeah, I think that there is one distinction though, which is often we have passive vocabulary and active vocabulary. So the passive vocabulary is the vocabulary we understand, but we can't necessarily use. And the active vocabulary is the vocabulary that we understand and we know how to use. So do you think that watching television and getting involved in Netflix or cooking dramas is going to help your active vocabulary as well? Or do you need to take extra steps?
I think if it's like a cooking show or a baking show, I think it will be words that you don't really need in your life at all. But if it's in like a drama, it's more of like a relaxed environment. And I think these ways, or movies too, this way is like a better way for you to learn words that is used like in real life.
Yeah, I really agree. I recently made a video of some ways to improve your fluency alone at home. And I looked at 2 apps actually that I thought were quite useful, and I'd love to hear your opinion. So one of them was an app called Hello Talk, and basically what it does is it joins you with other people who speak the language that you want to learn and are learning the language that you speak. So for example, in my case, I was linked to Spanish speakers who want to learn English. And that's because I'm an English speaker who wants to learn Spanish. And you're just put into these little message groups with them. And it's quite nice because you get to communicate and really communicate. You get to ask the questions that you want. So I was talking to a Mexican girl called Gabby, who was telling me about Mexico and her plans to one day move to abroad to a different country. And because we were typing, we weren't speaking face to face. It gave me time to think about the words that I wanted to use and how to structure the sentences. And I liked it because I was having to really use the vocabulary that I've learned. What do you think of that?
I think it's a great opportunity to try to make your own sentences, because I find that one difficulty with learning languages is that you end up knowing all the grammar and the vocabulary, but you don't know how to use it. So I think it's a good way to practice creating your own personal message or sentences.
And it's less intimidating than speaking to a native speaker face to face. I remember when I was learning Spanish in Spain, my favorite people to speak in Spanish to were the Germans in my class.
Wow,
so there
really?
were lots of Germans in my class speaking Spanish, and I preferred speaking to them because they understood that I was still learning and they had a similar level. And so it meant that we were very patient with each other and we helped each other with vocabulary. But when I was still a very low level Spanish, when I spoke to a native speaker, they spoke so quickly, they used words I didn't understand, and they weren't as patient with me when I was struggling to communicate my message.
I think I can relate with that too, because when I was studying Japanese and all my classmates were from different countries, and we had one thing in common is our love for Japanese. So we just had to speak in Japanese together. So it's quite similar to your situation.
Yeah. And did you find that it was nicer to speak to the people that were learning Japanese than to Japanese native speakers?
I would say in the beginning, yes, because as you mentioned, we don't know that much words yet, or we don't have that much knowledge in that language yet. So it's much easier to communicate with people from the same level with you. But then I feel like if you want to improve further, for me, I would recommend talk to a native speaker.
Yeah, that's when you really find out the nuances in the language.
Yes. My next question I would like to ask is, can you give short tips for each part of the IELTS exam?
Okay. So there's 4 parts of the IELTS exam. Listening, a tip for listening would be to pay attention from the very beginning, because the answers come in order. So don't daydream at the beginning and then start focusing in, because if you're not focused from the very beginning, you might miss a question. And as soon as you've missed one, it's so much more difficult to work out where you are. So what I would suggest is read the first question and then also the second question. And then as you go through the exam, just look at both questions so that if you miss one, you're not going to miss the next one as well and get lost. So that's listening. For reading, I would suggest looking at the questions before the text. And the reason for that is when we look at the questions, we get an idea of what information we're looking for in the text, because often we don't need to understand everything about a text. And examiners deliberately choose difficult texts. So if we read the questions, then we know what it is we're looking for. And it might be a lot more simple to answer the questions than to understand the text in its entirety. And then for writing, I would suggest for task 2, which is the essay, I would suggest just to get an idea of the different essay question types and to become familiar with what kind of structure you're going to write in your exam, because you don't have long. And if you know that you're going to have, for example, 2 paragraphs, and 1 paragraph you're going to mention 1 idea, and in the second paragraph you're going to mention 2 ideas, then it makes it a lot easier to move and write your essay in a much quicker time. And finally, the speaking, I'd recommend, well, first of all, I'd recommend if people watch our speaking test, because I think what you did was very, very nice, which is you kind of relaxed into it. You gave personalized answers. You weren't too worried about using high level vocabulary. You just focused on communicating your message. So I would recommend that for the speaking test.
Okay, thank you. I actually agree with all of them. And sometimes I get asked should we practice just one part every day, or should we like do the entire thing every day? What do you think?
Well, actually, I'd like to ask you first. What did you do?
I recommend everyone to do the whole paper in a day, like time it, and once you finish one part, you continue to the next one, and don't like relax or rest at all, because that way you'll be used to the tension of like taking the exam for a long period of time. So when you do the real exam, you don't get nervous.
I think that's great advice. Yeah. I would probably distinguish slightly between your early stages of preparation and your later stages of preparation. So certainly in the later stages, you need to build up the stamina of doing the whole IELTS test in one sitting. And so it's a very good idea to do those past papers where you go, okay, here's the writing test, now here's the listening test, now here's the reading test, and then ideally a speaking test as well. But I think early on in your preparation, you don't want to overwhelm yourself. So just focus on what you find difficult and give yourself time to get to grips with it.
I agree. Let's move on to the next question. So, which part of the test do you think should practice on the most? Like, should be focused on the most?
Writing. I think the writing is the most difficult. I've met quite a few people that have got 8 and 8.5 in speaking. I've met a lot of people that have got 9 in listening and reading. I've only really spoken to a few people that have got an 8 and only one that's got an 8.5. And I've never seen a band 9 in writing. And if you go on the IELTS.org website, so the official website, you can look at the average score. And what you'll find is for every language and every country, writing is the lowest. So I would recommend people prioritize and spend more time on the writing test than any other part.
I agree. I actually took my first IELTS about 5 to 6 years ago, and my score for writing was really bad, which was why my overall score was like lower than the latest one I took. Back then I think I got just a 6 because I did not practice at all. And I just like, I read through some of the examples, like just very few ones, and just head on to like the real test. That was like a big mistake for me.
And isn't that interesting? Because you got a 7.5 in your first speaking test. So you got 7.5 in speaking and then a 6, which is a huge, 1.5 band difference between the two different disciplines. Yeah. It's I really feel sorry for people having to do the IELTS writing test, because it is a very difficult test.
And sometimes like the questions are too challenging, especially the task 2. For my test, the latest one I took, the question was on like, do you think you should have one law in the entire world, or should every country have their own law? And I was like, I actually don't really know much about law at all. So it was kind of like challenging to kind of give an answer to them.
Can you imagine? And you've only got 40 minutes to write your essay. This is the kind of thing that philosophers and politicians spend their entire life debating. And they're like, oh, but yeah, just write that in 250 words in 40 minutes, please. So one thing I would suggest is on my website, I've got a model essay section. And a lot of people have really found that that's improved their writing, because all of those essays are band 8.5, band 9. And by reading those essays, you get a lot of ideas on a lot of different essay topics. And then you also see how IELTS teachers are communicating those ideas. So I really recommend reading those model essays. And in fact, a student recently who went from band 6.5 to band 7.5, which is a really good jump. What she did is she just read a model essay every evening, and then also wrote her answer. And she just did that for less than a month, and then was able to go up one band in her writing. And when I see that, I'm really impressed.
Wow, that's really impressive.
Yeah.
most people ask me like, should I just practice the listening and reading and just leave the writing and speaking because I don't have anyone to like correct it for me? And most of the time I would just say no to them, because like getting a teacher or someone to correct your grammar is really important. But if you have limited time, and one thing I would recommend is just using like, Grammarly, or just like the Word, Microsoft Word. They would just correct your grammar, like basic grammar for you. And if you write a lot of essays, you can see that most of the time the mistakes that you do is the same mistake that you just repeat the same mistake every time. So I think that's one thing I highly recommend. What do you think?
Oh, I totally agree. I actually made a video where I list the common mistakes that students make in task 2. So I look at articles, for example, and I say, okay, these are the common mistakes that students make with articles. With subject-verb agreement, here are some of the common mistakes with subject-verb agreement. Because like in my experience teaching IELTS for so many years, I just see those mistakes so regularly. And I also know that many people make those mistakes, and then because they're not corrected, they make those mistakes again. And you're completely right. Just putting your essay through Grammarly or writer.com, the free punctuation checker online, they'll hopefully be able to identify those mistakes early, which means they'll say, okay, I struggle with articles. I'm going to really pay attention to articles in my essay writing. And what I would recommend, for example, if you don't have the time or the financial resources, because it can be quite expensive to send your essays to a teacher,
That's true.
is basically just to write your essay, your practice essay, and then compare it to a model essay and say, what vocabulary did they use? What vocabulary did I use? Which ideas did they use? Which ideas did I use? How long was my introduction? How long was their introduction? And just make these little comparisons. And in that way, you'll start to bridge the gap, which will bring you closer to writing those kind of high level essays.
That's a really good tip. Thank you. How long do you think is the best for people to prepare before taking the test?
I think it depends on their level of English to begin with. So I imagine that, for example, you got an 8 in your IELTS speaking, and certainly very close to 8.5. Now, is that because you prepared for the IELTS test for 1 month, or is it because you've been learning English since you were 3 years old or 5 years old? It's probably because you've been learning English since you were 5 years old.
Yes.
So I think it's important to have a long view on language learning, and then just take those ideas and just to get a little bit of test preparation, test knowledge before you do your test. However, there are other students that don't have such a high level of English as you. And I think they need to spend longer on their English and on their test preparation, also depending on the score they need. So if they need a 7 in writing, you need quite a lot of time to get ready for that if you're, say, a lower level English speaker.
Do you think that the people who prepares for IELTS, they should prepare and like kind of get a score they want first before applying for the test, or should they just apply first and then practice?
This really divides people. I know some people like to just book the test, and then if they don't get the score, they go, okay, fine, I'll do the test again, and then they keep going until they get the score they need. But it's quite an expensive approach. Yes. I think it's probably worth taking into consideration that you might have to do the test multiple times to get the score you need, especially if you're looking for kind of band 7.5 area. So don't leave it last minute. Don't think, I want to start my course in September, so I'm going to do my IELTS test in July. Don't leave it so last minute, because you'll find yourself in a difficult situation. But I also wouldn't recommend the other approach, which is go straight into the test without any preparation. I think you really need to look at yourself and work out, what's your timeline, how long do you have, and what level are you at?
Now to the last question. So how to get more vocabularies? Is there like any recommended visuals or books or apps or anything?
Yeah, so I really enjoyed kind of our conversation earlier where we were talking a bit about the benefits of watching television and Netflix, because it's such a nice way to enjoy yourself and then come away with new vocabulary. Um, and so that's quite a nice kind of active approach to learning vocabulary. Reading as well is similar, especially because, like, if you're watching television, you have subtitles, you've got a visual reference for those words. You're seeing it written, and that really helps with your ability to remember. And then I would say it's good to put that vocabulary into practice, ideally through things like talking to people or writing essays or even communicating via online messages with people, for example, in the Hello Talk app that I mentioned. In fact, Busuu also have, I don't know if you've seen the website or the app called Busuu. One thing that I like is they show you a picture and they say either speak or write about this picture. So you type, I can see two men laughing. There's a dog in the background eating a sausage. There are three birds flying over the men. And these get progressively more difficult as you work up the levels. And then what it does, which is very clever, is it sends your writing to someone else, to a native speaker, and then they can correct your writing. So they can say, oh, it's not two man, it's two men. And then it's kind of fun because you're having to actively use vocabulary and then you're getting correction as well. And I think when we put language into practice, that's when we really learn it. And do you think your approach to learning a language will be different if you're planning to take a formal test in it?
Yes, definitely. I'm a type of person that would set goals first. So I would have a goal of how much I would like to get before I even decide if I should like take the test or not. I would look at the minimum score and I would have to get like my own score, like my own goal. And then I would try to like achieve that goal. Maybe I would just try I normally just like do a lot of papers. And then I would try to like see like the average score as well of like in total how well can I do in a test. And if I feel that I'm ready, then I would just like apply for or like book the test. But if not, then I'll just continue doing until I can like get the score I want.
That's a good idea. So for example, you'll say, okay, I need to get band 8 in listening, and you won't take the test until you've got multiple band 8s in your practice tests.
Yes.
Right. Okay. I like that. I think that says a lot about your personality, that you're quite thorough and you like to be prepared.
Yes.
I had one student on my website that's similar to you, except she never felt ready. She kept on saying, oh, I'm not ready. I'm not ready. And then, oh, I'm not ready. I'm not ready. And even though she was doing very well in all of her practice tests, she was kind of procrastinating and putting the test back and back. What do you think about that?
I think it goes with her personality. Like maybe she's not a very confident person, or she's just like the people around her might be really good. So that's why like she just like just have that like pressure on her that she doesn't feel that she's ready. I think she have to like try to get her confidence back and maybe try to just like do it first, like the opposite of what I mentioned. So do it first and then see how it goes. Like just leave it to the future. Like don't have to be like really like stressed over if she's gonna do well on that.
Yeah. Just give it a go, see how it goes, and then learn from that.
I saw from your website that you have like the vocabulary course. Can you tell us more about that course, please?
Yeah, so that vocabulary course is specifically for IELTS. And what we do is we've identified all of the kind of common themes and topics that appear in the IELTS test. And then we look at some advanced vocabulary for those common topics. So topics like the environment or roles and responsibilities or parenting and upbringing. And then we look at around 30 words, 30 advanced words that have impressed examiners in the past. We look at the collocations with those words, how we can manipulate them into different parts of speech. And then the thing that I think is quite important is you get lots of quizzes around those words. So you've got to put those words into sentences. You've got to change the part of speech of those words to make them fit into a sentence. And then you'll get things like pictures, and then you have to identify which words you can see. So, and at the very end, you also get a personalization activity where you're given those words that you're learning in a question form, and you have to use them to answer it. And at the end, you can print that off as well. So just lots of ways to practice particular vocabulary related to the common topics of the IELTS test.
Thank you very much for today, and please check out English Pro Tips channel as well. And thank you everyone for watching this video.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.